Nia had always been close to her mother. It had been just the two of them since her father left to start a new family with another woman. For years, her mother struggled, working long hours to provide for Nia. Then came Kojo, a kind, soft-spoken man who seemed to bring back warmth back into their lives. He was everything Nia's mother had prayed for: stable, caring, and ready to be a father figure, or so it seemed. When Nia's mother remarried, things changed fast. Kojo moved in with his son Tunde, who was just a year older than Nia. At first, everything felt normal. Tunde was polite, quiet, and barely spoke to Nia. But that changed one evening when Nia was home alone. It started small, Tunde brushing too close when passing by, staring at her for too long, making comments that didn't feel right. Nia dismissed it. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe this was how brothers acted. But the uneasy feeling in her stomach never left. One night, while their parents were out, Tunde knocked on her door. His voice was calm, almost casual, but something about it made her uneasy. He stood there longer than necessary, eyes heavy with something she couldn't quite name. When she refused to let him in, he laughed under his breath and walked away. That was the night Nia stopped sleeping properly. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house became unbearable. Tunde's presence felt suffocating. He waited until their parents weren't around to make her uncomfortable, standing too close in the kitchen, whispering things that made her skin crawl. Nia wanted to tell her mother, but fear held her back. What if she didn't believe her? What if Kojo took his son's side? One evening, while her mother was at work, Tunde cornered her in the hallway. This time, his words were direct. He wasn't just making her uncomfortable, he was making a demand. Nia's body went rigid. She paused past him and locked herself in the room. "Open up," he said. His voice was calm, almost playful, but something about it made Nia uncomfortable. She ignored him. He knocked again, harder this time. "I said open the door." Her hand shook as she locked it. Then the banging started. Loud, aggressive. Nia pressed herself against the door, heart racing. "Leave me alone, Tunde," she shouted, but he didn't stop. He kept hitting her door, rattling the handle. Tears welled up in Nia's eyes. She had never felt this kind of fear before. After what felt like forever, the banging stopped. She couldn't hear the footsteps walking away. She waited, listening, barely breathing. Minutes passed, maybe he had given up. Then before you could know it, the door burst open. Tunde stood there with his breath heavy, eyes dark with something she couldn't understand. Or maybe she could, but she didn't want to. Nia tried to run, but he grabbed her wrist and shoved her back on the bed. "Stop, Tunde, please," she begged, struggling again. But he was stronger, too strong. That night, Tunde took from her something she could never get back. When it was over, he stood up as if nothing had happened, wiped his face and walked out, leaving Nia curled up in bed, shaking, her body hot, but the pain inside her chest was worse. She wanted to tell someone, she wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but she didn't. She couldn't. She saw the way her mother glowed around Kojo, the way she laughed with him, how safe and loved she finally felt. Nia couldn't take that away from her mother. If she spoke up, everything would crumble. Kojo would defend his son, her mother would be heartbroken, and they would lose everything. So she stayed silent, and the abuse continued. Tunde came to her room when their parents were out. He waited for moments when she was alone. He learned her routines, her vulnerabilities. Each time Nia felt herself fading, she no longer felt like a person, just a body that existed in a house where she was supposed to be safe. She withdrew from everything: her friends, school, even her mother. She smiled less, spoke less, became a shadow in her own home. Her mother noticed but assumed it was just teenage mood swings. One night, after Tunde had forced himself on her again, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was how her life would always be. When Nia turned 18, her mother and stepfather threw her a birthday party. The house was decorated with gold and white balloons, and a happy birthday banner stretched across the living room. A cake sat in the center of the dining table, three tiers, perfectly frosted, her name written in cursive. Her mother and stepfather had gone all out, inviting a handful of her friends, playing cheerful music, making sure everything looked perfect. But Nia wasn't happy. She smiled when someone wished her, nodded when her mother squeezed her hand, laughed softly when her stepfather made a joke, but it was all an act. Every grin felt forced, and every laugh hollow. Inside, she felt like a spectator at her own celebration, like she was watching someone else's birthday unfold while she sat quietly in the shadows. The same year Nia turned 18, she wrote her JAMB. It wasn't just an exam, it was her way out. She had spent weeks buried in textbooks, pushing herself through endless past questions, clinging to the hope that this was her ticket to freedom. And when the results came out, she passed. More than that, she did well enough to get into the university she wanted. Relief, excitement, the thrill of knowing she would finally leave home. When the day came, she packed her bags with more anticipation than nostalgia. When Nia got to campus, she wasn't thrilled or that excited. She was just a bit relieved that Tunde wouldn't get to abuse her, at least for the time she would be in school. She tried settling in, but didn't make friends at all. She kept to herself more often and minded her studies. In her second year of school, Nia met Daniel. He was different from the other guys, patient, kind, and never stopped or overstepped his boundaries. At first, she kept her distance, pushing him away whenever he tried to get close. She had built walls around herself, convinced that no man could truly care for her without wanting something in return. But Daniel was persistent, not in an overbearing way, but in a way that made Nia question if maybe, just maybe, she could trust again. He didn't pressure her. He didn't demand explanations for her guarded nature. He just stayed, showing her in small ways that he was there, waiting whenever she was ready. It took time, years actually, but their final year, Nia had let him in, little by little. She still had nightmares, still flinched at certain touches, but with Daniel, she felt something she had never felt before, safe. When they graduated, Daniel didn't hesitate. He looked at Nia one evening, held her hands and said, "I want to meet your parents." Nia's heart stopped. She hadn't been home in months, barely even called. She kept the relationship with her mother surface level, avoiding long conversations, avoiding him, Tunde. Going home meant facing it all again. Why do you want to meet them? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I love you, Nia," Daniel said, "and I want to do the right things the right way." Nia stared at him, emotions clashing inside her. She had dreamed of a moment like this, being loved, being wanted for the right reasons. But the idea of stepping back into that house made her stomach turn. While Nia was battling her demons in school, Tunde was thriving. He had graduated a year before her and, with his father's powerful connections, secured a well-paying job almost immediately. In their community, he was seen as a model, young man, ambitious, responsible, and carried himself with the charm of someone destined for success. Kojo was beyond proud of his son. He often bragged about how Tunde was a perfect example of what a young man should be: hardworking and respectful, and equally focused. At home, Tunde played the role well. He was always polite, always helpful, and went out of his way to please Nia's mother. "Ah, Tunde, you're truly a blessing," she would say with a smile, watching him help around the house or bring home thoughtful gifts. And he knew exactly what he was doing. He made sure to be the son every mother wished for, the man every father could boast about. He carried himself like a gentleman, making sure no one ever suspected the monster that lurked beneath. Nia's mother grew extremely fond of him. She often praised him in conversations with friends and family, calling him the son she never had. She spoke of how he was different from other young men, his age, responsible, grounded, and destined for great things. She was proud of him in a way she had never even been proud of Nia, and it broke Nia's heart. Each time she heard her mother sing Tunde's praises, she felt sick. He had fooled everyone. The man who had stolen her childhood, who had haunted her for years, was now being celebrated. It was as if she was the only one who could see the truth, while the world remained blind. But she couldn't speak up. Who would believe her? Her mother, who saw him as the perfect son, or Kojo, his father, who worshipped him? The community, who only saw the well-mannered young man who had everything going for him. Tunde had played his game well. Nia hadn't stepped foot in her stepfather's house in over a year. But when Daniel insisted on formally meeting her parents, she knew she had no choice but to return. It was the only way to show him respect, to prove that she was serious about their relationship. The moment she and Daniel walked through the door, her mother's face lit up with joy. Kojo, her stepfather, was just as pleased. They welcomed Daniel warmly, impressed by his confidence and politeness. My daughter has done well, Kojo said, clapping Daniel on the back. A fine young man with a bright future. Nia's mother was beyond excited, already asking questions about his family, his job, and their plans for the future. She looked at her daughter with pride, as though she had accomplished something great by bringing home a man like Daniel. But across the room, Tunde remained silent. His expression was unreadable, but his body language was tense. He barely spoke throughout the evening, only nodding occasionally when Daniel spoke. Later, when they were alone, he went to his father. Father, I think Nia is too young for marriage, he said flatly. She just finished school. She should stay home, learn a trade, help around the house. What is the rush? Kojo frowned. She is 22, Tunde. That is not too young for marriage. If she has found a man who is serious about her, we should be happy for her. Tunde clenched his jaw. She is not ready. She doesn't know what she's doing. Kojo sighed, waving him off. Let her live her life, Tunde. It's not your decision to make. But Tunde was furious. That night, Nia sat alone in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling. She had thought coming back home would feel different now that she was older, now that she had Daniel, but instead, it felt like she was suffocating all over again. Daniel had lodged in a hotel room in town for the night as a sign of respect, since it was his first visit. He had wanted her to have time with her family, to reconnect. He had no idea that every minute she spent in this house felt like being trapped in the past. A soft knock at the door made her stiffen. She knew that knock. She didn't answer. Another knock, louder this time. Then the door creaked open. Tunde stepped in. She immediately stood up, her heart pounding. Get out, she snapped, backing away from him. He closed the door behind him, his lips curling into a smirk. Is that any way to greet your big brother? You are not my brother, she spat. Tunde chuckled, stepping closer. Oh, but I wasn't I? I was close enough to you more than anyone else. Nia felt sick. I said, get out. His expression darkened. I should be the one telling you that. You think you can just walk away, marry some idiot, and act like none of this ever happened. Nia's hands clenched into fists. That's exactly what I'm doing. Tunde shook his head slowly. No, you are not, because if you do. He pulled out his phone and scrolled for a second before turning the screen towards her. Nia's blood went cold. It was a video, a dark, blurry recording, but she knew what it was. Before even seeing more than a few seconds, she could hear her own muffled cries. She felt like she was going to throw up. Tunde smirked at her reaction. You really thought I was done with you, right? He whispered. If you marry him, if you even think of leaving, I will make sure the whole world sees this. Your Daniel will see it, his family, your mother, everyone. Nia shook her head, backing against the wall. You wouldn't. He leaned in, voice dangerously low. Try me. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, not in front of him. He smiled, enjoying her fear. Good girl. Now, call it off. Tell him you are not ready and stay where you belong, which is in this house. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Nia standing there, shaking, feeling like her world has just crashed down around her. She had finally found happiness, a chance to start over, and now Tunde was about to take that away too. Nia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone, Her hands trembled as she tried to process everything that had just happened. Tunde had won again. He had trapped her in a corner, forcing her to make a decision she never wanted to make. She couldn't let that video get out. She couldn't let Daniel or the world see the darkest moments of her life. But how could she leave Daniel without making it obvious that something was wrong? Then an idea formed in her mind. If she could get her mother on her side, if she could convince her that she was too young for marriage, then cancelling the wedding wouldn't look suspicious. It would look like a normal decision, a young woman choosing to wait. That evening, she found her mother alone in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner. Nia took a deep breath. Mama, I've been thinking, her mother turned with a smile. About what, my dear? Nia hesitated, then forced the words out. I think I might be rushing into this marriage. I mean, I just finished school. Maybe I should wait. Maybe I should focus on other things first. Her mother's smile faded slightly as she wiped her hands on her wrapper and turned to face her fully. What are you saying, Nia? That you want to cancel the wedding? Nia swallowed hard. I just don't think I'm ready yet. Her mother sighed and pulled her a chair, motioning for Nia to sit beside her. She took her daughter's hands in hers, rubbing them gently like she used to when Nia was a child. Nia, listen to me. I have watched the way Daniel looks at you, and I can tell he truly loves you. He is a good man, and good men don't come around often. Nia looked down, unable to meet her mother's eyes. You may feel like you're not ready, but my dear, sometimes we never feel ready for the best things in our lives. Love is a blessing, and when you find someone who respects you, values you, and is willing to build a life with you, you hold on to them. Nia's throat tightened. I already love Daniel like a son. He has been nothing but good to you, but I can see that he makes you happy. Why would you throw that away? Because I'm being blackmailed. Because I am terrified. Because the man who ruined my life is standing in my way. Nia said in her head. But she couldn't say any of that out. Instead, she forced a weak smile and nodded. You really think Daniel is the right one for me? Her mother smiled warmly. Yes, my daughter, I do. 2 months later, the traditional wedding preparations began in full swing. The house was buzzing with excitement. Relatives were visiting. Fabrics for the ceremony were being selected. And Daniel's family had already begun sending gifts in preparation for the knocking ceremony. Daniel was beyond excited. Every time he spoke about their future, his eyes lit up with love and anticipation. He made calls, visited her family regularly, and ensured that everything was going smoothly. He couldn't wait to make Nia his wife. But while everything was celebrating, Nia was drowning in fear. Tunde was out of town for work, but he made sure to remind her that he was still watching. Every few days, his messages came in. You are making a big mistake. You think I'm joking, Nia. If you go through with this wedding, I will destroy you. I warned you that if you marry him, the whole world will know what kind of girl you really are. Nia read the messages and deleted them immediately. She tried to push the fear away, to focus on the preparations, on Daniel, on the future she had dreamed of. But at night, when she was alone in her room, the fear consumed her. She wanted to tell Daniel, but how? How could she explain that the man he had shaken hands with, the stepbrother he had greeted so respectfully, was the one who had been tormenting her all these years? How could she tell him that a single video would ruin everything they had built? The day of the traditional wedding finally arrived. Nia sat in front of the mirror, fully dressed in her elegant African attire, her skin glowing from the fine makeup the women had applied. Her wrapper and gele were perfectly tied, and the jewelry around her neck sparkled under the warm light of the room. To everyone, she looked like the happiest bride. But inside, she felt empty. Her heart pounded in her chest, but not from excitement. Her hands felt cold. This wasn't how a bride was supposed to feel, she thought. Her mother, who had been watching her closely, noticed her expression and knelt beside her. My daughter, why do you look so sad? Today is your day. You're about to start a new life with a good man. Nia forced a weak smile. I'm just overwhelmed, Mama. Her mother beamed and kissed her forehead. That is normal. Every bride feels that way. But trust me, once you see Daniel waiting for you, all that fear will go away. Nia nodded, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. Outside the compound was filled with people. The ceremony was grand, with family, friends, and elders seated in a semicircle while the traditional wedding rituals took place. Daniel looked like the happiest man in the world, his rich traditional outfit fitting him perfectly, his smile bright with joy. But across the yard, Tunde stood watching. His eyes burned with something dark. He barely spoke, barely moved. He didn't join in the laughter or celebration. Every time Nuya looked in his direction, she saw it. His dangerous glances, his clenched fist, and the anger simmering beneath his composed face. She knew what he was thinking. He wasn't happy and he was planning something. But not today, Tunde, she thought. You will not ruin this day for me, she said to herself. As the traditional wedding ended, the celebration only got bigger. Music blasted through the speakers and people danced and laughed, eating and drinking freely. The entire house was filled with joy, and Daniel couldn't stop holding Nia's hand, introducing her proudly as his wife. More guests arrived for the after party, and soon the house was filled with people drinking, singing, and celebrating. Plates of food were passed around, bottles of drinks popped open, and laughter echoed through the night. As the celebration continued outside, Nia's mother took her by the hand and led her inside to change into another traditional outfit for her next appearance. The noise of the party faded as they stepped into Nia's childhood bedroom, where a second outfit was neatly laid out on the bed. You look so beautiful, my daughter, her mother said, adjusting Nia's jewelry with a proud smile. Let me go and get something from the kitchen. I will be right back. Nia nodded, her heart still heavy, but she tried to force a smile as her mother stepped out. The room fell silent, then the door creaked open. Nia turned sharply, her blood running cold. It was Tunde. He stepped inside, quietly shutting the door behind him. His face was dark with rage, his jaw clenched. What do you want? Nia whispered, her voice barely holding steady. Tunde didn't answer. He simply closed the door. Tunde, get out. He took a slow step towards her. You really thought you could get away from me. You thought you could just leave and be happy. This was it. He had been holding back all day, but now that no one was around, he was going to make sure she regretted everything. I told you not to go through with this wedding, he continued, but you didn't listen. You even ignored my messages. You ignored my warnings. Now you will pay for it. He longed at her. Nia tried to fight back, but he was stronger. Just like all those times before, he grabbed her wrist and shoved against wall, his breath hot against her skin. Tunde, please, she gasped, struggling, but he only tightened his grip. You think you belong to him, right? He hissed. You think some stupid wedding makes you his? You will always be mine, Nia. Tears burned in her eyes as she fought with everything left in her, but she was weak from the stress of the day. Tunde pushed her into the bed, forcing himself over her. Then the door swung open. Nia's mother stood frozen at the doorway for a moment. The world stopped. Then she screamed, Tunde, what are you doing? Her voice was so loud it cut through the music outside. Tunde jerked back, his face twisting in shock. Nia was already weak and trembling, scrambled away, tears streaming down to her face. Nia's mother rushed forward, grabbing her daughter, her face a mix of confusion and horror. She turned to Tunde, shaking with rage. What are you doing? She screamed again. Outside, footsteps rushed towards the house. The guest had heard. Tunde barely had time to react before the door burst open. Kojo and Daniel rushed in, their faces twisted with confusion and concern. The sudden scream from Nia's mother had drawn them in, and now they stood frozen at the sight before them. Nia was on the bed, sobbing uncontrollably, her clothes slightly disheveled and her body shaking. Her mother stood beside her trembling, her face pale with shock. And Tunde, he stood there, guilt written all over his face. What is going on here? Kojo demanded, his voice laced with panic. Nobody spoke. Nia couldn't even find the words. Her cries filled the room, her hands covering her face as her body shook violently. Daniel turned to her, his heart pounding as he crouched beside her, gently holding her arms. Nia, talk to me, he whispered. What happened? Her mother was the one who finally spoke. Her voice was broken, raw with pain. I walked in and I saw Tunde, she stammered, looking at Kojo, her husband, the man she had defended, the man whose son she had loved like her own. Tears rolled down her face as she pointed at Tunde. He was forcing himself on Nia. The room fell into a dead silence. Then, in a flash, Daniel lunged at Tunde. You monster! He roared as his fist flew towards Tunde. Tunde barely had time to react before Daniel's rage exploded. But before he could land more than a single punch, guests who had rushed in held him back. Let me go! I will kill him. Daniel struggled, his entire body shaking with fury, but the men held him firmly, trying to calm him down. Nia sat there, her sobs uncontrollable, her body unable to stop shaking. She felt exposed, broken. Daniel turned back to her, his own eyes filled with pain. He knelt beside her and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried into his chest. I'm here, Nia. I swear to you, I'm here, he whispered, his own tears falling. The guests, sensing the weight of the moment, were quickly dismissed. The once lively celebration had turned into something else entirely. The next day, the atmosphere in the house was cold. Tunde sat stiffly, his face emotionless, while Kojo looked pale, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The truth had shattered everything. A few family elders had gathered, but most importantly, so had the police. Nia sat at the center of it all, her hands gripping her mother's tightly. Daniel sat beside her, his arm protectively around her. Then Nia spoke. For the first time, she told everything. Every time Tunde touched her, every time he had forced himself on her when she was younger, how she had blackmailed her with a video, how she had lived in silence, terrified of speaking out because she didn't want to destroy her mother's happiness. As she spoke, her mother wept. She held on to Nia's hand tightly, whispering, I'm so sorry, over and over again. Kojo, sitting in silence, looked at his son as though seeing him for the first time. His once proud expression had crumpled into something hollow. The police officer nodded grimly as he took down notes. Then he stood and turned to Tunde. You are under arrest for sexual assault and blackmail. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. Tunde's face finally changed. For the first time, fear flashed in his eyes. As the officers handcuffed him, dragging him towards the door, he twisted back, his voice desperate. Dad, please, say something. You know I wouldn't. But Kojo didn't even look at him. And just like that, Tunde was taken away. Nia sat there, tears streaming down her face. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was a relief. For the first time in years, she was free. As the police car drove away, the weight on Nia's chest felt lighter. She had lived in fear for so long, carrying the burden of her pain alone. But now, the truth was out. The monster who had haunted her was finally facing justice. Her mother, still in tears, pulled her into a tight embrace. I should have seen it, she whispered, guilt heavy in her voice. Nia shook her head. It's not your fault, Mama. Daniel held her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. You are safe now, he said softly, and you will never go through anything alone again. For the first time in years, Nia believed that. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. And no matter how broken she had felt, she now knew she was stronger than her past. The moral of this story is that silence only protects the abuser, not the victim. Nia suffered in silence for years, but once she found her voice, justice was served, highlighting the importance of speaking up. Evil often hides behind a good reputation, as seen with Tunde, who appeared perfect on the outside but was a monster behind closed doors. Parents must be observant and create a safe space for their children to speak out without fear. Healing through difficult is possible. And Nia's journey shows that support and truth can lead to recovery. Finally, Justice is essential as abusers must be held accountable regardless of how much time has passed. If you or someone you know is facing abuse, speak up. Tell someone you trust. Seek help. No one deserves to live in fear.